brings quite a rowdy crowd with her. So I'm Wendy, the director of the school, and so welcome everyone here tonight. It's great to see you all on this lovely sunny evening. So there's seats up here if you get So we have the watercolor class coming to join us. That's how you get everyone to come, you start honking. So I know most of you know Jess, so she doesn't need a big introduction. But Jess has been at Visa for 3 years or 2 years? 4 years. So, and it's not the end of the relationship with Visa. So it's been quite a pleasure to work with Jess, and especially all the contributions you've given in terms of like with your knowledge of art history and philosophy, and it's really nice to see it come together in your exhibition. So as many of you know, Jess recently graduated with a Diploma of Fine Arts from Visa, and the show downstairs is a graduation exhibition. So it's a culmination of a year's worth of work, but actually probably a lifetime gathering information. And so how we're going to do this is Jess is going to give a talk, I'm not too sure how long, but like let's say half hour, 40 minutes. And then afterwards we're going to go down and join her in the gallery, and she'll talk about the work in situ. It's an installation type space, so we didn't want to have chairs blocking the view of the artwork, so that's why we're up here first. And then downstairs there's water and beer and wine by donation. But if any of you are dying of thirst during the talk, there's a room at the end of the hall, room 1, and there's water in the fridge, and there's glasses on top. So just so you know that. So, well, welcome. Thank you for taking the talk.
I noticed that the light just went out, so I'm not sure if that's
there's someone.
technical.
That's not a great sign.
Well, welcome everyone. It's great to have a full room, and it's great to take one more shot at this before I retire from Visa and go on an artist's maternity leave of sorts. And I have to preface all of this with a big thank you to my mom, Colleen, who was my co-curator for the show and my main child care provider through the last year at school. She really enabled this whole process. So I want to thank you to her and acknowledgement of that. Thank you. So I want to talk tonight about, while we're up here, I'm going to give you some background on kind of some of the things I've been thinking about and interests that I've had. Some of it gets really nitty-gritty history nerd stuff. Some of it might be kind of far-out connections that you might not follow, but it's just kind of a fun, this is what I think of as fun, romp through Western history. I did my bachelor's in history and art at McGill University and graduated that from the University of Victoria. And one of the things that I started studying art history because I was really interested in modern art, and I had parents that were artists and studied art, and they would look at abstract paintings and say, oh yes, that's very good, or oh no, that's not very good. As a kid, it's like, how can you tell it's an abstract painting? So that's what spurred my interest in art history. But once I got to school, I discovered early Christian art and architecture, and found this amazing, 2,000-year history that's really a coherent history in the West. And there's so many, they call the department history in art, not art history, because you can study all these streams of philosophy and religion and political science that are coming together. So that's the big picture background to what's happening tonight. And so starting there, this is a picture of Constantine's Basilica. It was built by Emperor Constantine in 310. And the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity, was, I believe it was 1314 or 314 or 315. And what you see is a Roman basilica. So it's a Roman architectural type, and it's made for public gathering spaces, for huge public gatherings. So you have this huge open space for gathering, and then you have the apse, which is that concave shape at the end for the speaker, and it's a practical acoustic arrangement. And then you have on the right here a plan of Santa Costanza, which is the tomb that Constantine built for his daughter who died of some kind of terrible leprosy or plague. She became a saint because of the famous healing powers associated with her relics. And the tomb is on the central plan, and so instead of having a linear plan where everyone's facing forward and the speaker's at the front, you have her body would have been here, and you have an ambulatory space that goes around the body. And so who cares? Well, this represents a major shift in Christianity and in thinking, because first you have a public space that's for above ground public civic religion. Then the thing I'm leaving out here is that the Basilica plan was adopted by Christians for all of their cathedrals. So it became the main form for Christian architecture in the first millennium. So you have that form that's for a civic religion. You show up in your Sunday best and see who's there and who's who and all of this. And then you have this central plan church that is, well, this is a mortuary, but that was adopted for Greek churches, the Greek cross church. And you have something that's contemplative. You're supposed to just, as an individual, and walk around the space. And so this represents and comes to lead towards a type of a contemplative, interior, personal way of relating to one's spirituality. So that was amazing, and I saw this photo and this plan, and all of that could come out of it. There's a little show on the Knowledge Network recently about the Dark Ages, Age of Light, and he talks about this as well. I recommend looking that show up online. Then fast forward to the second millennia of the current era, and this other common era, and you have the Gothic cathedrals. And cathedral was a church in which the bishop was the priest. So the bishop is the administrative head of a region. He's also a priest, but because he's also the administrative head, that's what makes him the bishop. And a cathedral is the church where he's the priest. And cathedral is based on the word cathedra, which means chair. So bishop sits in this church. So that church becomes the flagship church of kind of the diocese, which is what they would call the administrative geographical area. So in Victoria, Christ Church Cathedral is where the bishop, the Anglican bishop, is the overseeing priest. And then there's all sorts of little Anglican churches in Victoria and even up island. But the bishop for this diocese sits at that cathedral, so that's why it's a cathedral. It's nothing to do with the architecture. It's about the administrative kind of who's there. But because they kind of know who's going to be there in advance, the architecture grew up around that, so it becomes kind of they put more effort into it and more time. So Gothic cathedrals are famous because they have these innovations. The Gothic arch was an innovation where they could go higher, and that meant they could have higher windows, and there was a better distribution of weight, and so again, more windows means more light, and so it was this enormous innovation, and Gothic cathedrals became, they are still recognized as this amazing moment in art history and architectural history of a huge innovation. And what interests me in this is this other idea about, in Christian thought and in Scripture, they talk about that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So I very quickly started thinking about architectural spaces, projecting myself onto architectural spaces and kind of again, I was talking about the Santa Costanza being thinking about contemplative space versus a public space. And so I started to lift these images of Western architectural history and started to collect them physically in clippings and in my mind and in kind of their significance, to start to think about my own sense of myself, the seat of my own soul. And in my kind of dabbling and looking into the Gothic era, I just kind of got really into John Ruskin, who was responsible for the neo-Gothic revival, the Gothic revival in the UK in the 1800s. And so a lot of the universities and architecture there, he relit the torch for Gothic architecture and re-examined the positives of Gothic architecture. And he has a very sceney kind of biography, and that's because, so he's fallen out of vogue. But he was one of the most famous art critics and social thinkers in the early 20th century. And so Quentin Bell, who was his biographer, he was a Bloomsbury Group member, one thing he said about Ruskin was always inclined to alternate between art criticism and social theory. The history of architecture enabled him to discuss the religious questions that were already troubling him and the social problems of which he was now dimly aware. So I wanted to include that because I felt affirmed in my own interest in architecture as a way of kind of talking about religious questions, social questions, personal questions. And so someone who was working on that 200 years ago and really got really far thinking that way. So this is the first piece that I think this is like the progenitor of the series that you see downstairs. And we did this in Rachel Helmer's intermediate drawing class. And it was really, when I lit upon this, I really found my voice. And what you see here is on the left, there is a tracing. This is on graphite on mylar. There's a tracing of a cathedral, basilica-type cathedral in Italy. And I really enjoy tracing. There's something meditative about it. If you've taken a class with Wendy, you'll know you can't leave Lisa without learning about tracing. And if you've taken any Western art history of the 20th century, you'll know that thanks to Andy Warhol and even Ingres, tracing is okay. I think we have permission to trace and call it our own. And so one of the things I was trying to learn about here was tracing this arcade of columns and to see how quickly they diminish, to get that linear perspective. I wanted to get some muscle memory about how quickly that actually happens, where they go from kind of half or even the full page here to just a quarter of the page in such a short distance. And as I started working with that, I was also thinking about, I also had this striking experience as I was tracing that even though cognitively I was approaching the altar here in the church, physically it's still a two-dimensional surface. So you're not getting any closer. And so spiritually speaking, it really captured this feeling I was having at the time of wanting to kind of approach the holy, but not being able to. Like that, so you can feel like you're getting closer, but you actually, when you're drawing on this part of the page, you're no closer, you're not going inside the page, you're not getting any closer than you are when you're out here. And that was something very therapeutic for me, and I thought was really interesting. And then what we have over here is a tracing of Frank Lloyd Wright parking structure. And I've always loved collage. That's my first love in visual arts. And so I superimposed this exterior modernist structure with this highly ornate Renaissance European linear perspective structure. And then I'm also then superimposing the sacred and the profane, again, exterior and interior, and it's like the light bulb went off for me. In two pretty quick, I just took two things and put them together, and I unlocked all these levels of meaning that were significant for me. then I started working more with tracings of the interiors of churches and letting myself do some collage, and so this is where it started to get more exuberant, and I really felt like I was on my way. And here again is where I'm starting. Now I've got a handle on what I want to do, and I kind of, I've got a formula now, and I'm starting to churn them out. And one of the things that happens is with the tracing, I find you get exhausted. There's a way that your mind and your hand get physically tired. And so then you just want to kind of muck around or do something really fast and loose to balance that. So that's kind of what's happening. It's really process oriented. And then you have here some photographs of some textiles, religious vestments. So you have then the monumental architecture and then the more domestic, sacred making of devotional work of embroidering, altar cloths and that sort of thing. So then I started thinking, okay, so I'm interested in interiors, I'm interested in architecture, and I'm interested in juxtapositions, and I'm really talking about, in this one, I think it captures this idea of wanting to really, feeling the pressure or having the expectation to make careful, studied work, and then I'm just not up for it. At a certain point, I'm exhausted, and I want to just let loose a bit and be more expressive. And so I wanted to work with those juxtapositions. So here I have a tracing of, this is an American colonial interior, probably somewhere in Virginia, and then I've superimposed and taped over a tracing of a photograph of my own kitchen table. So I'm starting to superimpose again the past and the present, and starting to think about an idealized interior that I want to kind of clutter up with my own junk and kind of express that difficulty in the artistic process. We can't quite get clear. There's always something there, but maybe that's the thing. Maybe it's not about getting clear and rendering something perfect and careful. Maybe I want to actually express the difficulty of getting that clarity and the imperfection. So here we have, I think this is Hereford House in the UK, so it was a royal dwelling, and then I collaged into it some still lives again from my own home. And here we have a throne room, English throne room, and I've got some, so this is all traced. I use an opaque projector to trace it, because I really like how you start to see, you can kind of capture this, the way the space is rendered and the scale to get that linear perspective, but at the same time you can see the artist's own hand and how they're kind of faring and thinking about the process. And then I superimposed work tracings from my own home, still lives from my own home, and then I felt that night that it needed a pile of dirty laundry in the corner. So thinking about other contemporary artists then that are working along these lines, this is a work by Ki-Sok Yoon, a Korean artist born in 1975. And this is a 4 by 3 foot ballpoint pen drawing on paper. And here's a detail. So she goes into her mother's and grandmother's closets and draws what's in there. And she says, as I correct mistakes, because she's working with a ballpoint pen, you can't erase, the work results in double or multiple lines, which reflect how my perception has changed over time and makes me question my initial perception. Paradoxically, greater concentration and more lines make drawn objects less clear. The more I see, the less I believe in the accuracy or the reality of the images I draw. So here's someone that's working with the difficulty of just actually making work, putting pen to paper and concentrating enough, and that struggle of kind of rendering something accurately and yet being somehow enticed by the results that mistakes leave on a page. And she's working with clutter, domestic clutter. And so as I was, so this is kind of where one of the things I've been reading while I was working on this series was Thomas à Kempis, who wrote The Imitation of Christ, and that is the most widely circulated book after the Bible. He wrote it in 1420, and it's just kind of a guide to, you know, being a practicing Christian. And in it, and that book, again, it's like the Santa Costanza of Christian writing, where it goes from being a public civic faith to talking about your own, considering your own heart and soul, and being a private contemplative faith. And so a quote that grabbed me from it was, he said, "Sit like a sparrow, solitary on the housetop, and think of the excesses in thy soul. Go into your room and shut the door. Shut out the whole world and all the tumult of vices. Shut out the whole world and all the tumult of vices." And so I thought this really captured kind of this theme that I'm working on, where I'm trying to concentrate and get clear, and then there's always this stuff I can't seem to sweep away to be able to concentrate enough, and I keep being drawn back to this clutter and this junk. So here's another piece that I did in 2013, and this is a tracing of a Renaissance Annunciation scene, and then I've superimposed some mylar drawings again of the clutter in my space. So so now I have the clutter and the things, and I also now have, as the idealized space, an Annunciation scene. Going back to John Ruskin, he talks about, and talking about architecture, there's this really interesting thing he did where he said there's these moral elements of the Gothic spirit that you can observe in the architecture. And so this list here, they're kind of the same quality, but on the kind of a positive extreme to a negative extreme. And I love this kind of categorized thinking. And one of the ways that one of the reasons, jumping from that clutter idea to Gothic architecture is this, that John Ruskin, the reason he felt Gothic architecture ought to be celebrated was that there is a way in which Gothic architecture is so dense with ornament. He thought that the workmen were really free, and there was this way where it was just completely, he says the richness of the work is part of the humility. The humility is the very life of the Gothic school. It's shown not only in the imperfection, but in the accumulation of ornament, a magnificent enthusiasm, an unselfishness of sacrifice, which would rather cast fruitless labor before the altar than stand idle in the market. So that actually conjures to me that work by Hyssop Yoon we saw, where it's this kind of like irrepressible desire to be creative, and it leads to a mess, but that's kind of the offering you're making. The second most essential element of the Gothic spirit, Ruskin says, is that it broke through the law wherever it found it in existence. It not only dared, but delighted in the infringement of every servile principle, and it invented a series of forms which the merit was not merely that they were new, but that they were capable of perpetual novelty. So here we have the classic three orders of architecture, Greek architecture, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. And here on the right, you have Ruskin's watercolor of, I think it's the Doge's palace in Venice. And what he's observing is that these medallions are all different. These capitals, each one is different. They have a strict regime of how it ought to be laid out, but then every single one of these little areas of detail is different. And that goes completely in the face of this, where you have to choose if you're going to do Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian, and then stick to it the whole way through the building. So there's something I found about this that was very sympathetic I was very sympathetic to. The other thing that Ruskin talked about was the Gothic. It was particular to, and this maybe gets a bit racial, but it was particular to the cultures north of the Alps, where you had to kind of hew things out and with cold hands, hew them out of stone, and it was rain and it's windy and there's wolves. Like, he writes at length in poetic kind of prose about like this, the way the weather and climate of the north influenced the Gothic imagination, whereas in the south he kind of talks about it being servile and like everyone's eating dates in the sun, so no one bothers to be creative. And being of Scandinavian heritage, I thought, yeah. I think also studying art history, there's so much Italian stuff that you kind of wonder what's going on in the north, and they, they kind of skip over the medieval dark ages, they call it the dark ages, where it's more kind of the northern European kind of what's happening up there. So on that little tangent, here's another contemporary artist that has always interested me. Her name she goes by Mama Anderson, and she works out of Sweden. And she does these interiors with these peculiar, they're like still lifes, but there's something a bit uncanny about them. And she plays with mirrors, so you have kind of interior and exterior superimposed without clear boundaries. And while I was putting this together and jumping back and forth between contemporary art and Gothic art, Suger of Saint Denis was an early patron and theorist of Gothic architecture. Said of Gothic architecture, the dull mind rises to truth through that which is material. So he's commenting again how the concreteness of architecture, the material reality, actually allows your mind to rise higher than it would, kind of free from those encumbrances of materiality. So I kind of thought, let's pair that with Mama Anderson tonight and talk about just these funny little knickknacks and also these prepared spaces. In Montessori education, the idea of a prepared space for a child where you set it all up for the child to enter is really essential. So here again, there's a very overt play of interior and exterior where they're superimposed and you're not quite sure what's going on, if this is a house with the walls falling down or a stage set. And so I finally knew that I wanted to work with architectural interiors. I wanted to work with thinking about sacred spaces, and I wanted to work with an idealized space. And so I started the work this year, I started to go through my collection of images and kind of what do I want to work with. And this, I was like, I could work with Vermeer, I could work with architectural drawings, I could work with Ruskin's watercolors, I could work with Vuillard's, those wonderful paintings of the pattern, his parents were in textiles. And anyways, this is what grabbed me. I had always come back to this image in my art history textbooks, and this is an altarpiece. It's the Dijon altarpiece by Melchior Broderlam, and it was done in 1398. And this piece is significant art historically because it's kind of the first foray into painting when we it's a major point when we cross from illuminated manuscripts into painting on board. And so we have actually still the gold ground here that you would have for an icon, and yet it's not completely static, and you have kind of these things like a little hawk in the air that kind of break the rules of the icon and bring it more into real life. And the thing that formally would catch your attention is that this is called a gloriette, this little porch or gazebo form. It's actually composed on the diagonal, and so it creates a more dynamic composition that draws the viewer in. So I thought, let's work with this, let's start here. And as I started to kind of unpack it, there was it's like these things are so rich iconographically. I mean, I'll do a little primer on the Annunciation, but in this piece in particular, speaking about architecture, what you have here in this pink building, according to legend, Mary was raised in the porch of the temple. She was kind of donated, as it were, to the church and raised in the temple. And so this is supposed to represent the Jewish temple. And this dome shape represents, to the medieval eye, is just kind of a general Oriental style architecture. So it represents Jerusalem and the East in something foreign. And then you have this porch that's attached to the dome, and it's clearly Gothic. The giveaway is these pointed windows here, and this trefoil pattern or detail on the top of the window. And so actually what you have here, just in the architecture, is this idea of they're unpacking the whole meaning of the Annunciation, where Mary is the first convert to Christianity. She's Jewish. She's shown reading the book of Isaiah, which is the prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. And so what the artist has done here is they've shown the old dispensation under the law with Judaism, and then you show Mary inhabiting this Gothic porch, which is the new dispensation, which is under light and with the new covenant when the Messiah comes. So I was kind of like, holy cow, like, that is so much packed just into the architecture. And I mean, that's all just kind of like, that's the stuff where I'm just like having fun. That's not even like central to, you know, the work or to my work. That's just like, that's how rich these images are and what makes them really fun for me to work with. I think, because it was just visually, it grabbed me. So I decided, from there I kind of started looking around, and I wanted to work with illuminated manuscripts, and I decided to work with Gothic manuscripts, so things from Flanders and France from the 13th and 14th centuries. And some of the things that make a manuscript an illuminated manuscript are mainly, one, technically, the gold leafing, so it's illuminated, it sheds light. And then the marginalia, or drollery, which is around the edges, which is supposed to kind of, it's this, again, this expression of this irrepressible kind of Gothic creativity that's supposed to just glorify God, even though they may have kind of cats and dogs in the margin of a story that has nothing to do with cats and dogs. And the reason that they're called, another reason they're called illuminated is that these are not illustrations, they're more than illustrations. The way I just described how packed the iconography of that building in the last slide was, this decoration actually enhances the meaning of the text. It's more than just they were sitting like this and there happened to be, you know, this color curtain there. It's iconographically packed. And art historians would insist that you cannot separate the text from the image. So when you get downstairs, if there's any art historians here, you'll be horrified that I separated the images from the text. But the other thing that I don't know if it was necessarily in mind, these were precious objects. A manuscript would sell for in the tens of thousands of livres at the time, and a knight, a knight is someone of a noble class. He would make about 30 livres in a year. That would be his wage. And so these manuscripts were worth tens of thousands of livres. And the other thing that the decoration of these texts did was it actually ensured the survival of the text. So people maybe weren't thinking about that when they did it, but it meant that when we get to the Renaissance, a lot of the ancient Greek and Roman scientific and philosophical writings survived because they were illuminated and returned into these precious objects that people collected and coveted, whereas the things that were scratched out on papyrus, they kind of fell to the wayside. Another way that manuscript illuminates the text is this process called moralizing. This is a page from the Hours of Jean d'Avro from 1325, and it's called a moralized Bible. And what they mean is that they take two images from different stories in the Bible and put them on facing pages. And what that does is it forces the reader, or it invites the reader to make a comparison between those two stories. And so it brings out more in those stories, and it creates this third layer of meaning that's greater than kind of reading the stories separately. And so in this case, we have the Annunciation on the right, and it's paired with the betrayal of Jesus in there. So there's Judas kissing Jesus on the left. The third thing that I found really interesting about manuscripts and medieval art was the way that this iconography that was present, its significance would be forgotten and just kind of put in there through convention. And I came across this sermon from the 1300s, and the preacher is responding to, I guess, enough of his parishioners were asking him, in the Annunciation, there's always a lily in a wine pot in between Mary and Gabriel. Why is that? And so he makes up this story to explain this convention that no one remembers after hundreds of years of it being there, why it's there. So he says, it happened once that a Christian and a Jew sat together, a wine pot between them. So classic Christian and Jew having a drink. And they discussed the incarnation of Christ. After the Christian had explained that belief in it is similar to the easy belief that lilies grow without human intervention, the Jew responded, when I see a lily spring out of this pot, I will believe and err not. So it becomes this little visual device that this is the moment of conversion for Mary. It says in the scripture that she's in a huge amount of tumult when the angel first approaches her, and she's doubting it in a major way, as we all would, what the news he has to bring her. And so by placing this wine pot with the lily springing out, it's a way of saying the lily sprung up, or she's shifted from doubt to belief. And it's a visual device then to suggest at what moment this is in that story. And I found that really interesting because art historians are often kind of, there's the lily, that means purity. The angel brings the lily for Mary to say purity. But if you look on the right here, you have, this is an Eastern Orthodox Annunciation scene, and there's a little pot with a flower, but it's not a lily. And so I think that is a good argument that it's more about this idea of a plant springing up miraculously than about the lily being as a symbol for purity. So between this kind of reinterpretation of forgotten symbols, this idea of moralizing, of juxtaposing two disparate images together to create a larger meaning, I like to kind of draw on that as a way of giving permission in my own work and kind of mining medieval thought for a way of looking at and reading images. And then we have just a quick primer on the iconography of the Annunciation. The Annunciation is and the reason I'm talking about this is that first Melchior Roederlang altarpiece. I said, okay, I'm going to start here. And so I limited my sources to Annunciation scenes from the 13th and 14th century in Northern Europe. And so, because you have a personal space, you have this interior space where there's a gloriette and a porch or a bedroom that she's always shown in, and you have a young woman that's in there, she's at study, and I thought, well, that's interesting. We think that the medieval Christian era would be completely misogynist and anti-women, but here you have a 14-year-old girl reading a book, which I told you how much books were worth. She's in a room of her own. Virginia Woolf said, to write fiction, a woman needs money and a room of her own. So, I mean, I really like kind of revising this symbolism of the Annunciation to become something that I can relate to, being a woman in my studio, kind of seeking inspiration and study. And so as you kind of look to read a scene of the Annunciation, Mary is almost always in blue, and the significance of blue, the pigment, is the only pigment I managed to also use in my work, and it's ultramarine, which is French for beyond the sea. And I used to think ultramarine meant like bluer than the sea, like ultraviolet means beyond violet on the spectrum. But it actually means it's beyond the sea, and that it's from beyond the sea. It's from Afghanistan. It's made from lapis lazuli, which was traded along the Silk Road and then came to Europe and was ground up and made blue paint. And it was precious because it came from Afghanistan and because it was light fast. It didn't fade over time because it was made from the stone. And in Renaissance contracts for commissions, artists, they specify how many figures there will be, how much gold they will use, and how much blue they will use, because the blue paint was as expensive, if not more expensive, than the gold. And in Giotto's Scrovegni Chapel, the blue on the frescoes has actually been scraped off of Mary's robes because they took it because of its value and to reuse it. So blue it's kind of almost still intuitive after thousands of years that blue is a heavenly color. It kind of represents the heavens, the water, things celestial. But in Hebrew iconography, blue was the color associated with the tabernacle, and the Ark of the Covenant was covered with a blue cloth. And the high priests wore robes of blue to represent their closeness to God, or their closeness to celestial things. So I thought that was amazing to discover that Mary isn't just clothed in kind of this like woo-woo spiritual color. She's actually clothed in the color that's the same as the high priest robe. So again, there's another point in the box towards Mary being an incredibly strong, celebrated figure. And then in Western art, she's always shown reading. And I like this one in particular because there's even all these books up on the shelf above her. And she's reading the Isaiah prophecy, as I said. And then the thing that caught my attention was how much furniture there was for reading in the Middle Ages, because books were so precious and reading was such a rare skill. You always see a lectern, and you see, often now we would be ashamed to kind of show that we have to use our finger or a piece of paper to follow the line as we read. But you can sometimes see Mary is holding a very ornate kind of placeholder as she reads. And then there's often a curtain or a canopy over her, which, so like here, which may be just kind of talking like an anachronistic thing where she's all we know, even though it's an Annunciation, the moment when she conceives, we also know that she later becomes the Queen of Heaven, and so they put this kind of throne-like canopy over her. But I also think it has to do with just this furniture of reading. And as an aside, in Eastern iconography, she's shown in this scene spinning or knitting red wool, which is, I think, a very different take on the figure of Mary. And so then we have, so this idea of working, what am I doing working with medieval illuminated manuscripts as a contemporary artist? Well, again, for one more little piece of permission, another contemporary artist working with manuscripts is Shazia Sikandar. She's from Pakistan, born in the 1960s, not 196. And she's trained in the traditional art of Persian manuscripts. And so she prepares her own paper using vegetable dyes, tea stains, and watercolor, and she's thinking about gender and heritage as well. So, she quote, commingles the age-old tradition of miniature painting with explicitly modern media revealing the tensions and imbrications in the iconographies of West and East, Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity, past and present. So I think it's really interesting that there's another contemporary artist working with manuscripts, because for a lot of the things that I've said, reasons that I've described, I think illuminated manuscripts fit for our time right now. There's this kind of way of, there's such a rich way of mining history, and there's such a visual, they're so rich visually, and there's such a visual culture now. And this idea, I also like kind of going back into the archive and taking these forgotten images and discovering all of this meaning and this opportunity through the way they looked at, learning about how they looked at images with the moralizing and the illumination, that it gives us permission to kind of put things together and read more into them than we might read into them on their own. And I also would note that she also is messing it up. She also bringing in that clutter and that chaotic, busy, kind of contemporary struggle to do things precisely. She's not going for the precision. She's going for the precision, and it's like it winds a spring, and then you have to let go and kind of go over the top with it. So I would invite you to now come downstairs and see what I've done with all of this background. I guess to preface that, I would say that what you'll be seeing are buildings. I've taken the figures, I've been working strictly with Annunciation scenes, and you'll recognize, you'll be able to find these two sources. These are two sources that I've used. This one on the left is a source. This is actually a tapestry that's been copied. It's a copy of this, which I find really interesting. And so this is also a main source. And what I've done is I've removed the figure because I wanted it to be more about the architecture than about the narrative that's taking place. And I kind of thinking about that Thomas à Kempis, about striving to shut out the tumult of vices. I've explored different ways of rendering, whether I'm doing exact, precise copying of these buildings from the manuscripts, or I'm doing blind contour, where I'm not even looking at what I'm drawing of these images, or some kind of variation in between. And I think that for me, that's expressing this struggle to kind of think about scripture and faith in a way where, on the one hand, there's an expectation or a pressure to get things exactly right and get the doctrines right and get the verses right, but then you also want to integrate it and believe that it's a living thing, and so that's going to be a much messier and yet more lively kind of picture. So, thank you for your time. I know it's hot in here.
It's just amazing. I was in that drawing class with catalog yesterday. Yeah. It's just where she's gone from there. This was part of it. I love the integration. Yeah, it's
Ziakin-Cook, and it's from the 14th century. And so I've done a carbon copy, and then I've done it in gouache and true to color, to the original color. And then this figure here is where I was still kind of figuring out what to do with the void left. If I take the figure out, should I just fill it in as if nothing was there, or should I leave the void? And in this case, I kind of brought the tile pattern up into the form. So from here, I then did a blind contour drawing of that image. So blind contour is when you're looking at your source and then you're drawing without looking at what you're drawing. And the reason it's called a contour drawing is that you're supposed to be moving your hand at the same speed as your eye, and that your eye and hand are working together to imagine what it's like to actually be touching the contours of the object that you're drawing. And so that's usually done with an object that's in life in front of you. But in this case, I was working with a two-dimensional source. And so it was a really interesting exercise and way of reanimating the space, because I was looking at a two-dimensional source, but imagining what it would be like to run my hands over the molding or across the floors. And so you have then what I would call kind of the old dispensation under the law, where it's exact and trying to do everything by the book and to the rules. And then you have the new dispensation, which is the freer interpretation and integration of the work. From here, then I felt I wanted to make the work. So then I got some balsa wood, and these all were calling me for months to make them, and I finally got to start making them. And this was the first result, where, and it was really interesting as I made them that the idea of this kind of, that this might actually have more life and interest to it than that, it fell away as I was working with the balsa wood. You just want to put things at right angles and make the corners flush, and so it became a very normal, exact model again. From there, so to get back to the free form, what I did here, this is a blind contour of the model after I've made it. And so what you have then is a blind contour drawing, again, where the idea of thinking about touching the work, where the object is integral to the drawing, But here I've made the work, so my hands know this so much better than they did when I did that one. And what you can see underneath is a little homage to Robert Rauschenberg. I have under here a tracing of that drawing that I then erased. And so there's the kind of, so the idea of tracing a blind contour is the idea of kind of like memorizing a poor translation. It's like you're working really hard with something that's not quite right, and you're working by rote with tracing. And so then I erased it, and I did it for what I would call an earnest blind contour drawing of the actual form. And so this is, so I have superimposed here two kind of approaches to religious faith and scripture, where you have, again, like the kind of working really hard with bad material, and then working more in earnest in a freer way. And then, so then it was kind of like these blind contour pieces are really the, it seems like they're really where my strength was, and so, but I really loved building these because there's so much on-the-go problem solving. And so down here you see my most recent work.
That's okay.
Where you have the buildings that are now actually based on the blind contour drawings. So this is based on that drawing, and that one is based on a drawing that didn't make it into the show, so you just have to imagine it. But so that's what you have here then, is this idea of this, can this free form kind of unrooted approach actually exists? Like, Zane didn't think I could do it.
I don't think there's anything you can't do.
And I actually should say a big special thanks to Zane too. Wendy and Zane were my advisors, and they really encouraged me and pushed me, and Zane helped me build all of these plinths and the lectern over there. So you're very generous.
It's my privilege. Yeah.
So are there any questions or comments?
I just think this is fascinating that you've made this structure based on the blind contour. And it's a nice irony somehow.
Jess, do you want to talk a little bit about the space, like the tiles, or some people might think this is part of our regular floor.
Yeah.
So, and then Colleen's column.
Yes, Colleen's column. Yeah, this is something that my co-curator and I developed as a way of marking out the space within the space. And I haven't been, but I hear in Europe, in a lot of the churches, they have these tile patterns on the floor, and it's a way of demarcating the boundaries between a chapel and the main aisle and that sort of thing. So, and the other thing is that an artist in the Middle Ages, one of their main responsibilities to their patron was to do tile patterns and kind of design those gazebo-like forms, the gloriettes. And painting was at the bottom of the list. It was tile design, gilding, and tapestry work, and then painting was kind of the lowest priority. So these tiles are kind of a nod to that, the role of the artist, the way that the floor can be used to delineate sacred space, and just a way of making this space, this gallery space itself, actually a prepared space. And so then the same with the column. In the column here, so Colleen actually built this all up, and then this is an enlarged copy of the marginalia from one of the manuscripts, and it's pretty neat what happens when it gets blown up.
I'm very drawn to your sculptures from your blind contours. They're really lovely. There's an elegance to them. They sort of remind me of Mirandi's paintings.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, really lovely.
And really nice height. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a decision, right? How to make I don't really have things plinths, I think
Yeah.
those columns.
Yeah.
But how,
yeah.
what height to make them, and it's just really nice.
Yeah, I wanted to do a nod to the Gothic architecture by having different moldings on each of the columns. And then I decided to make them higher than gallery height because I felt you wanted it to be kind of a heart height. Like they're kind of heart size, heart related, so they're kind of at heart height. Plus I wanted to be looking at them and not kind of download them.
So the columns really become a big part of the piece.
Yeah.
They're not separate. It's really
Yeah.
continuous. Does anyone have any questions for Jess?
I'm wondering what you're going to do with all this beautiful art. Are you going to sell it, or?
It's for sale, and I have a show at Exchanges in February, so I hope to make some more of these sculptures for that show. Yeah.
Well, the show's up until Monday,
Yeah.
so tell all your friends
Yeah.
and make sure you come and get them to come see it.
Yeah. And in the meantime, I think over the winter, some of the paper drawings will be at St. Philip's, Oak Bay. They have a kind of a gallery space where they'd like to show work.
Is that the stairway?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they'd like,
That'd be
it's a
great
good place
project.
to store
Yeah.
it without completely storing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're doing another talk as well.
Well, it's tentative.
Oh.
Yeah. But yeah, there might be more Annunciation lectures around come Advent season, and we're thinking about that. Yeah. So thanks again.